we had an African-American guy who was a fan of mine. Great fan, great guy. In fact, I want to find out what's going on with him. You know what look at my African-American over here. Look at him. Are you the greatest? Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay. So we have an African.
So we're beginning this episode with a clip from the 2016 campaign trail in which presidential candidate at the time, Donald Trump, discusses a black supporter in the crowd and invites rally-goers to, quote, look at my African American. Now, 10 years seems like a long time ago, but actually in some ways it just seems like time is standing still. This is the What Happened to Candace episode of the Political Junkie podcast. I'm Claire Potter.
I'm Neil J. Young.
And today, after the news summary, we're going to be talking about Republican influencer Candace Owens, which is part of our continuing coverage of what seems to be a MAGA crack-up leading into the 2026 midterms. But before we go there, Neil, you've got something to share with our listeners, don't you?
Yeah, big news. I can finally officially announce it. I've known about this for a while, but it's out in Publisher's Lunch today. So once it's there, it's really official and public, which is my next book project just got announced. I'm actually co-authoring it with my good friend and colleague and Claire's good friend and former colleague from the New School, Natalia Melman-Petrozella, who I think we mention on here pretty regularly.
We do. We love her.
We do love her very much. The book is a history of the Hamptons. Our working title is The Hamptons, How a Remote Strip of Land Became the World's Most Luxurious Playground. We'll see if that's the title that actually makes it into print, but we're writing a 400-plus year history of this very unique and distinctive American place, but a place where we also think a lot of the biggest themes of American history can be explored and examined. How a place was both built in a real location, and also how sort of the idea of quote unquote the Hamptons came to reside in the global imagination. I'm sure I'll talk about it a lot more over the next couple of years as I write and before it comes out, but really fun to have this now out in the public.
It's incredibly exciting, Neil. And as somebody who's been sort of watching the backstage as this project made its way from a little glimmer in yours and Natalia's heads to a contract and the big announcement, I'm really excited. I've read some little bits of it along the way, and I can tell you, listeners, it's going to be a lot of fun, but it's going to teach you a lot about American history by doing what good social and cultural history does, which is focusing on one thing that teaches us a lot about the United States, right, Neil?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I'm sure I'll have little nuggets to share along the way, but now we got to write it.
Yeah, maybe we can get Natalia on closer to the time that the book is coming out, and maybe even closer to summer, because that's when we all want to talk about the beach.
Yep.
Okay, Neil, so let's get to our news summary this week. And I think the top story has got to be oil. On Monday morning, prices on the global crude oil market briefly cracked $120 a barrel. That's an almost 90% increase since the days before Donald Trump started a war on Iran. And actually, things have only gotten worse. All of those oil tankers that are bottled up around the Straits of Hormuz are sitting ducks for Iranian torpedoes. I think a refinery in Qatar recently took a hit. And for some reason, Donald Trump doesn't seem to think that's going to be a problem for the United States. Neil, why is it a problem?
Well, it's a problem because oil is a commodity traded on, a global market. The price is the same regardless of where it's coming out of the ground, or regardless of also where it's being pumped. And Americans should expect to see rising prices across the board, not just when it comes to what they're paying at the gas pump, but everything. utility bills,
Right.
food. I mean, so much of, anything you purchase has some sort of connection to oil and to oil prices. So this is a disaster. These numbers are astounding. It's a big deal, certainly huge news. It's
Right.
sort of wild to me, and I'm curious what you think, Claire. Why are Americans not more outraged about this? I mean, I know a good chunk of them are being counter-programmed by, a conservative media industry that, is only existing to, pump up Trump. But people have to pay for gas. They know what the reality is.
Yeah, there was a part of me that wanted to get Meg Jacobs on, a woman who teaches at Princeton, who wrote a book called Panic at the Pump about like the trauma of the 1970s, which is high gas prices and long gas lines. We're probably not going to get to the long gas lines, but we've gotten to the high prices very, very quickly. By the middle of the week, the prices had risen an average of 27 cents a gallon. Now, that's an average across the United States, but California, Florida, and Pennsylvania are seeing way higher prices. California is in the fives, over $5 a gallon. And here in Western Massachusetts, there are Uber drivers who are just quitting because they're saying they can't make any money and pay these high prices. Now, I think your question, Neil, which is why are Americans not up in arms about this? I think it is adding to the slow boil. I mean, we've been using this word affordability. I think we need to shift to unaffordability. The large numbers of Americans who commute to work. Now, let's say that since the pandemic, fewer people drive fewer days to actually get to their jobs. That's true. So it's not going to hit pocketbooks the way it would have, say, in 2019. But we're talking about people who are living paycheck to paycheck, even though they have fairly decently paid jobs. I was reading in the New York Times about people saying, well, they're going to have to cut back on medication and food in order to pay the prices for their commute. And, where we're going to really start seeing the pinch is in things like energy prices. Electricity prices are going to go up because it's not just oil, it's natural gas. Apparently 20% of the world's natural gas comes from Iran.
Wow.
So I think the big question is also, why was the Trump administration caught so flat-footed about this? What do you think, Neil?
Well, I mean, we sort of got into this a bit last week, and I think it's also relevant to almost any time we talk about the Trump administration, what they do. Just such a lack of planning, such a sense that so much of what happens is sort of fly by the night, responding to, this guy's whims. And it's one thing for those to happen with, executive orders or, tariffs on, tariffs off. It's a whole nother thing when what we're talking about is launching a war in the Middle East. It just is astounding to me how unprepared this administration really was for what they actually launched. And that's only been revealed more and more in the days that have followed since then. There's no exit plan here. There's no strategic goal. The other day, what was it, yesterday? He said that the mission was accomplished, and it was accomplished because he said it was, and that it had been over after hour one, which only begs the question what was going on in hour two, let alone in the days which have followed. So, I think you're, just to get back to the affordability thing and sort of Americans' reaction, I think you're right that maybe what we should be watching for here, especially as it develops, over the next, 10 months leading into midterms, is that slow boiling rage. And if that's how this gets played out, because again, so many Americans have a particular psychology tied up in Trump and their own relationship to him. And it may be something that they can't sort of openly express, but this is something that's building that, hopefully so, that we'll see in the results in November.
Well, I think that's right. And I think one of the things that really astonishes me is, the Bush administration plunged into war and they didn't make it up as they went along. They actually took a lot of time to sell this war, to develop a communication strategy, to bring Americans on board. And they were fairly successful at that in the first couple of years in the war. I mean, all kinds of people, like NFL football players, were signing up to fight in it. People like Pete Hegseth, who at the time was working in finance in New York City, left his job and signed up to join the military. So there was a certain segment of society that was really inspired by the first war on terror, mistakenly so, but it was a good communication strategy. What's astonishing about the fact that someone like Trump, who has been in the business of communications his entire life, I mean, really all real estate is communications on a certain level, is that there seems to be nobody who can either hold him to a particular narrative or thinks they can, so they just don't even try.
Right.
They all tell their own stories, which contradict each other. And then certain kinds of things, like Trump coming out and saying that the United States is self-sufficient in its energy production, so it really doesn't matter. Well, as you said right at the beginning, there's a global market for oil. It doesn't matter. You can be pumping it out of every single backyard in the United States, and it's still going to cost the same as if you're pumping it in China, which actually that's the one good thing is China gets a lot of its oil from Iran, and they're sort of in a tough spot right now. But it's all of this sort of mixed messaging, inaccurate messaging, and nobody seemed to say to him, actually, that's not how oil works. I mean, I think if somebody like me can understand the pricing of oil futures, I'm an English major and a history PhD for crying out loud, not a wildcatter. But in fact, all you would have to do is look on Facebook. I mean, I have an old friend from Yale who spent his entire career in the oil business. He's MAGA up to the eyeballs, as far as I can tell. Mm. And his first response was, oh, no, this is a really bad idea. And he said, once oil goes over $80 a barrel, you have effectively disrupted the global economy. There's nothing you can do after that. Yeah. So this is going to take months to shake out.
Wait.
Yeah. So don't drive so much, Neil, in Florida and California, which happens to be where you live. So speaking of the economy, in Maine and Ohio, where Democrats have targeted 2 Republican incumbents, one in each state, recent polling says that a MAGA policy problem, not an energy-driven problem, is the top economic stressor. In Maine, Governor Janet Mills is polling even with Susan Collins, and weirdly, Graham Plattner, who is challenging Janet Mills for the Democratic nomination, is polling either even or only 2 points behind Collins, depending on what poll you're looking at. It is Plattner who seems to have momentum in this primary. And then in Ohio, Sherrod Brown is now polling 2 points ahead of John Husted. Sherrod Brown, of course, was an incumbent for years in Ohio. He's very, very well known. Husted has some little problems. He's sort of enmeshed in a corruption case there. But it really seems like Trump administration policies are undermining some really, really solid Republicans who should not be having any problem being reelected, right?
That's right. And the Ohio story is the one that really stands out to me because, I think everyone thought that Ohio had become so fully red that it sort of wasn't really worth following too closely anymore. A state that for a long time had been fairly purple, but seemed to have moved, firmly into the red camp in the last decade or so. And so this number really jumps out to me. I've mentioned on here before, my husband's from Ohio. We're actually headed there this weekend for his dad's birthday. So I will keep my eyes peeled to see how many Sherrod Brown signs I count. Sherrod Brown is in a lot of ways a very beloved figure in Ohio and had a long career there, but really, paid the price for the sort of Trump turn that the state took. But I think, these are places that I think are really interesting in terms of white rural voters, which constitute a big chunk of both these states' electorate, seeming to like sour on Trump and sort of this Trump era, these Trump policies that you mentioned. If these states are in play, and particularly if Ohio is in play, I think, it really speaks to what feels like a blue wave for November. I mean, I feel like we have to knock on all the wood in front of us to not jinx it, but the Ohio is just really, really sticking out to me here.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, the New York Times this morning had a Ross Douthat column that was headlined, "The Democrats could still blow this." And I'm like, in your dreams, Ross, in your dreams. I mean, yes, they could.
Yeah, they could,
but I think this idea that the Democrats are somehow so untogether and so incompetent in the face of what is going on in the Republican Party. Same New York Times this morning, Michelle Goldberg had a column about an open fascist who is running for governor in Florida. And, he's a fringe candidate, but you tie that together with the fact that the Turning Point USA chapter at Florida International University just had its own racist, anti-Semitic, Nazi-loving, Holocaust-denying group chat exposed. Which is, by the way, against the law in Florida because they passed a very stringent anti-Semitism law. But it really just seems that the Republicans can't put one foot in front of the other. So I agree with you. I think seeing this kind of gain in Ohio, but also Maine, where Susan Collins is beloved in both parties.
Yeah.
So, and that's Maine for you. But yeah, let's keep our eye on this, see where it's going.
I think Maine is, definitely keep our eye on Maine, because I think Maine becomes really interesting if Graham Plattner rather, gets the nomination, because I think if it's like Janet Mills versus Susan Collins, it's like, two very well-known white women in the state who have had long been in public office. I think Susan Collins probably grinds out a victory against Janet Mills. I think if Plattner has this, as you said, he has the momentum right now, and it just feels like that momentum would continue to carry through the general election in a way that just speaks to sort of, voters wanting to throw the incumbents out. So we'll see how this shapes up, but I think there's potentially a really interesting story there as well.
Yeah, and just to put a coda to it, it seems like Plattner was able to ride out the Nazi tattoo thing, which again I think is very Maine. Like, who hasn't gotten drunk and gotten a Nazi tattoo?
Who among us?
That makes him a little more real or something. Okay, so back to Texas just for a second, Neil. As Senator John Cornyn and Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton gear up for their runoff, a Democratic poll with a Trump plus 14 sample shows James Tallarico in a statistical dead heat with either opponent. I mean, I don't want to go crazy on this, Neil, but are conditions actually ripe to snatch a Texas Senate seat too?
I'm just still not feeling strong enough to say that that's really what's going to happen. I mean, I think, it's interesting to think about Texas and Ohio here. Ohio really does feel in play to me, and I can imagine Sherrod Brown pulling off a Democratic win there. We kind of touched on this last week when we were talking about Tallarico, that Texas is over and over again this place where people think, this is the time that the Democrats going to knock a Republican off, and it never happens. And actually, a lot of the times when it's looked really close in the polling, the actual election is quite a landslide still for the Republican. I think this is going to be a tight race, period. I think Tallarico is a good candidate for this state in this moment as a Democrat. I just am not really prepared to say that he has a fighting chance of winning. I think these polls are going to shift a lot once we know who the actual Republican is. And so part of this is just a little bit of just the sort of chaos that's still a part of this race. But Tallarico's a strong candidate, and I think, again, the conditions on the ground in Texas are the most favorable for a Democrat than they've been in a very long time.
Yeah, I want to start a conspiracy theory that Ann Richards isn't really dead and that she's going to come back and run for governor, just sort of jump into the race. But, the thing about Tallarico, and I can't really get a fix on him, I had a deep and irrational dislike of Beto O'Rourke. And I never thought he was the great white hope of, bringing Texas back to the Democratic Party. I thought Colin Allred was a closer look, and he got blown out of the water.
Yeah.
Tallarico, I can't tell. And I was looking at the attacks on him on X this week, and they were mostly of the attacking his masculinity variety. He's a soy boy. He probably drinks soy lattes, blah, blah, blah. There was also some weird clip about how he thinks that there are 6 genders, and that's a terrible thing. But I didn't really feel like they had anything on him that was particularly ugly and awful. I mean, he looks like the choir director.
Yeah, that all just feels so weak and so, in a way, almost outdated. I mean, those are pretty standard political attacks.
Yep.
But they also feel pretty tired already. Like they were really in play in the last couple of election cycles in a lot of ways, for how they sort of inflame the culture wars around gender and sexuality. But I don't know. It just feels like, is that really the playbook folks are going to come back to again? It just feels like that's played out. We'll see.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. All right. So our last news item is sort of like, I don't know, it's just kind of sweet or something, like a Looney Tunes cartoon. It looks like longtime frenemies Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer, who have been fixtures in the Democratic House leadership for decades. And I can say a little bit more about that if you want. Well, they're in one last final battle, both of them on a dragon, heading toward each other. What has happened? Pelosi has endorsed Harry Dunn, a former Capitol Police officer who testified about the January 6th coup, against a former Hoyer aide, State Delegate Adrian Boafo, in the primary for the 5th District in Maryland that Hoyer is vacating in 2027. Now, why Nancy Pelosi thinks it's her business who replaces Steny Hoyer, I do not know. No, it seems wrong. Now, Dunn also lost a previous congressional bid in 2024, also endorsed by Pelosi, so maybe that's a sign that she should stay out of it. There are also 22 other candidates vying for this Democratic line on November's ballot. What is going on here, Neil? It's like 2 old people sitting in their wheelchairs shaking their fists at each other.
I know. Can these 2 get a room? I mean, it just feels like, maybe that's inappropriate to say, but it's just like, what is their what is the thing for, or like, what's the attraction there in terms of like,
right.
I found it really interesting. I didn't know this part, that they both have been sort of frenemies and rivals since their Capitol Hill intern days. I mean, like, that's how long this goes back. Obviously, like Nancy Pelosi, if people may forget, is from Maryland herself, grew up there. And so, they've sort of been in each other's, around each other and in each other's business for a really, really long time. I just, when I read this, I was just like, I get that, this used to be her job, but it's not her job anymore. So what is Pelosi doing weighing in on this spot? And it just feels like her last FU to this guy that, she's had this ongoing, I mean, this isn't ideological. This is like personal, right? It's just like,
yeah, she's beaten him at everything. He never got to be, Speaker of the House. She got to be Speaker of the House. I mean, it's just, Steny Hoyer does have one prize, which is he is remarried. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
He lost his wife. And he fell in love with Elaine Kamarck, who is like a old schooly Democratic political consultant. She was on all the talk shows all the time, super, super smart, up in the Clinton stuff all the time. So I think that's partly why Steny is retiring, is he just wants to hang out with Elaine Kamarck.
Good for him.
I mean, Yeah, I know. What a prize to get at the end of your life. What Nancy is doing, I do not know. But I agree with you. It's sort of like she can't let him win at anything. Now, having said that, one of the things I really do not like is this whole hand-picked successor thing. Do Democrats do that more than Republicans do?
Well, I mean, let's think about the way that Trump has put his thumb on the scale and has been the kingmaker over and over again in the last decade. But that also feels a bit of an aberration with how, I think it's not unusual for, folks to endorse someone for their seat, but it does feel like something we hear about a lot more often with Democrats in terms of just sort of the passing of the baton. Can I say one more thing? I think Steny Hoyer has going for actually two things. He has a great name. I have always loved his name.
Yes.
And it's like, I don't want to live in an America when those are not the names we have like in circulation. Like there's just something like throwback wonderful about it. He is also a very handsome man, like who has aged so well. I want to know his skincare regime and the name of his surgeon, but go enjoy your retirement, Hoyer. Like enjoy your wife, go to the beach, hang out with your grandkids. Don't worry about this race.
Hard agree. Yes, I've always liked Steny Hoyer too. And so my understanding that the logic behind all of this handpicked successor thing is you pick your aide because your aide knows the district like the back of his hand and knows everybody in the district and knows where all the bodies are buried and so on. But that's exactly why I don't like it. There's no reason why a new person can't learn the district. And it is exactly that kind of thing that makes Americans say both the parties are the same. We're just being governed by elites recirculating themselves and so on. And I really think that Democrats should make a huge effort not to do it. Jerry Nadler did it. It's just wrong.
Yeah.
And I wish they would stop.
It doesn't feel like American democracy should have a line of succession, right? Like that's sort of not how this is supposed to play out.
Yeah, hard agree. Okay, so let's turn to Candace Owens. Who is Candace Owens and why is she saying these terrible things about Erica Kirk? Now, I've heard a lot of these terrible things because to prepare for this podcast, Neil, I listened to Candace Owens' podcast. And in particular, the series called Bride of Charlie. Although I had to stop because I thought I was a smart person, but I actually cannot follow all the threads of the conspiracy theories. So why don't you start by telling our listeners who Candace Owens is and why we care?
Well, I think it's useful to know sort of her background if you haven't really. You might be very familiar with her because it would be hard not to be if you follow American politics. She's hugely influential as a, media figure, as an internet presence. She's only 37 years old, I think a very beautiful and attractive, and I think that's part of how she's been successful woman, African-American woman. She grew up in Connecticut, in Stamford, Connecticut as a liberal. She became sort of famous as a teenager in Connecticut because she filed this lawsuit in federal court, which alleged that when she was a senior in high school, she had not been protected from racist bullying. And she actually won that, or at least it was settled, I believe, by the Stanford School Board, and she got like about $40,000 for that settlement. She went on to the University of Rhode Island, worked in journalism, finance, marketing, sort of in those different fields. But in 2016, she founded this thing called socialautopsy.com, and this was a website where users would report bullies. So how did socialautopsy.com play into the transformation here, Claire? Like, how do you think that is significant for the biography and sort of the political direction Owens ended up?
Well, it's interesting that the racist bullying at Stanford High School became such a prominent part of her autobiography. It's mentioned everywhere. If any profile you read of her, it comes up. I don't recall it being such a big deal in Connecticut at the time. And it should have come to my attention because I worked in Connecticut, not far from Stamford. And one of my relatives was actually working for Daniel Malloy, who was the mayor of Stamford at the time. He later became the governor of Connecticut. And Malloy's son, who I think is kind of a troubled person, or he had a lot of problems growing up. Malloy's son was involved with the whole thing. So, but I do not remember it, and I certainly do not remember it being connected to Candace. But I think the reason it plays such a prominent role in her autobiography is she styles herself as somebody who was jolted out of the delusions of liberalism.
Yep.
By the cruelty that she suffered in this liberal town, in this liberal high school. And you know, I believe it happened because it happens to lots of kids in high school for lots of reasons, whether they're black or Jewish or gay or something like that, this sort of organized bullying. What's interesting is that once, you know, she bopped around to a bunch of different jobs when she graduated from the University of Rhode Island. Journalism, finance, marketing, and then sort of jumped into the social media thing with Social Autopsy. Now, what was interesting is it coincided with Gamergate, and this is where things get really, really weird. Gamergate, our listeners may remember, was the bullying of two women who were game designers online, but they were also doxxed. They were also threatened at home. And the whole line was that, you know, they had only been successful because they slept with people. That was the story. One of them was a woman named Zoe Quinn, who actually wrote a great book about how to protect yourself on the internet. But what happens is that Owens builds this site, and then some of the Gamergate women come to her and say, well, actually, you know, what you're doing is you are creating the capacity to dox and bully other people by posting people's information online. And Owens didn't seem to have understood that from the get-go. I'm not quite sure what she did understand. She's a somewhat opaque person. But anyway, so Owens got into it with the Gamergate women, and then sort of began to wage an aggressive online campaign against them while Gamergate is still going on. And then Owens claimed that they started bullying her, that they were sending her racist hate mail, that they were doxing her. And ultimately, Social Autopsy fails because it was being powered by a Kickstarter. And when all this stuff started swirling around, the Kickstarter just sort of dissolved. So she had to close it down. Now, this apparently is the moment that she then converts to the idea of conspiracism as the thing that powers the world. And that what happened to her project, and let's just say lots of internet projects fail for lots and lots of reasons. But it's also not a very good space for women, obviously, and it's not a very good space for Black people. And so this is, of course, the nature of conspiracy theories, right? It's like you can be saying something that you have no evidence for, and yet it's connected to real ways that people experience the world. Okay? So what happens in 2017, Neil?
Well, then she launched this new website called Red Pill Black, and this was sort of marketed as this counterpoint to the narrative that the Democratic Party had ever promoted the interest of Black Americans. So, you know, she's arguing that the Black Americans have been red pilled, and this really, really increased her fame and especially opened a lot of doors for her in conservative media, right? She became a frequent guest on Fox News, so she could talk about this very thing, right? Like she's constantly on there talking about how, you know, liberal or democratic policies were this long-term strategy to make Black Americans dependent. And then she wrote a book I think it came out 2020. It was called Blackout: How Black America Can Make Its Second Escape from the Democrat Plantation, right? This idea that Black folks were, as it says there in the title, enslaved to the Democratic Party, and that, you know, the Democratic Party had never delivered anything for them. And so I think we're starting to get a sense of the through lines, or like some of the threads that really connect her biography and sort of trace through this political evolution, or this sort of political trajectory that's like leading to the things we want to talk about here. But a lot of conspiracism, a lot of sense of grievance politics, a lot of ways in which she's actually using her identity to, I think, make a name for herself in conservative media, and even as, of course, you know, identity politics would be something both she and that conservative media universe would, you know, disavow. What else do you think is really interesting here in terms of what's happening in these years for her?
Right. Well, I just want to toss something in here that I think is important. And Heather Cox Richardson talks about this a lot. Our friend Michael Kazin has written about it in his book, which is that there is a narrative in the Republican Party today. The Republicans have taken ownership over every piece of history labeled Republican Party, whether it's Lincoln or Teddy Roosevelt and so on. They've taken ownership of all of that and said, this is the Republican Party and this is what it's always been. Mm-hmm. And then they say, well, you know, the Democratic Party was the Ku Klux Klan, and the Democratic Party was Jim Crow and white supremacy and suppressing the civil rights movement. All of which is true. Yep. But what they don't say is that both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party had conservative and liberal wings, and that they were regional in many regards. And so what's unusual is that by 1980, conservatives have all sorted into the Republican Party, and progressives have all sorted into the Democratic Party. But this is a historical confusion that the Republican Party exploits. So people like Candace Owens, and as a Black woman, she sort of claims a kind of identitarian authority over this kind of knowledge. She says, well, it's the Democrats that enslaved people. Now, when Candace is really getting down to it, she has also been known to say that actually Black people enslaved themselves. Yeah. That actually it was a sort of failure of get up and go before 1865 that caused people to be trapped in a vicious and violent system of coerced labor. So there's a lot of crazy stuff that is tossed in there. But what's interesting about her, and I'm glad I spent a lot of time listening to her, is she has a very calm, rational way of speaking. And it's not until you sort of sit there and say, but wait, what about that? You could even begin to sort of take it apart and say, this is not a reasonable human being who is telling me things I need to know. So there's another little piece here. And really 2016, 2017 is the real space where Candace Owens becomes the person she is today. One being that she gets on board with Donald Trump. Okay, so she's anti-Trump before 2016. Once Trump is elected, she becomes pro-Trump. So she's really one of the first influencers that seems to get it, that Trump is an opportunity not to be lost. The other thing that happens to her in 2017 is that she's hired by Charlie Kirk at Turning Point USA as what was her title? She was the director of urban engagement.
Oh, wow.
Right, urban being, of course. Okay, so why do they have to do that? They have to do this because Turning Point USA had problems with racism last week, but it had problems with racism all along. And in fact, there were people who were quitting Turning Point USA, white people who were quitting Turning Point USA because they said it was such a cauldron of racism. So Charlie Kirk hires her. And she works for Turning Point USA. Now, put a pin in that, because this is, I think, the place that she's coming from for trashing Erica Kirk now. And we will circle back to that. But the other thing she becomes is one of, literally, I don't think this is hyperbolic, literally maybe a dozen prominent Black people who are Donald Trump supporters. Mm-hmm. And most of the rest of them are either businessmen or Kanye West. And she becomes very close to Kanye West, particularly in 2018, where they appeared together on TMZ to defend the Unite the Right rally, assert that slavery was a choice. They later opposed Black Lives Matter together. So whereas some of the Black Trump supporters are just like wealthy guys, right, like the guy who owned Papa John's and so on, there are others. Well, I think Kanye West is actually not a well man. But Candace seems to have sort of picked out a path that in which she could seize the mantle of Black conservatism for herself. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know if she would describe herself that way, but of course, how she would describe herself would not probably be something that we would recognize as really all that accurate. Right. I mean, who knows what she would say of herself, but I think that, it's not so much that she was looking to, I don't think there's evidence to suggest she was looking to lead like a Black conservative movement, right, as much as she was looking to sort of stand out in a way, in a pretty crowded, especially at the time, digital social media, conservative realm that was rising up around Trump. And so she certainly right. stood out. I mean, in many ways, unique for her biography and for her identity, and sort of the way she positioned herself within this sort of bizarre constellation that arose around Trump. The connection with Kanye West is like really wild, but I think speaks to her opportunism, and mm-hmm. how much we see, I don't know so much turning on the dime that she does, but a constant, like, she's changing things up constantly to find sort of the next moment of relevancy and sort of, where she can find a niche that allows her to sort of, build and keep an audience.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, and as you said earlier, she's an extremely good-looking woman. And of course, Trump likes that. Yeah. And it causes her to fit in, although thank heaven she has not done the things to her face and body that a lot of white women have. But she has also, and this is the part that it is opportunism, as you're saying, but she's staking out a certain ground. And the anti-Semitism is something that is not necessarily very pragmatic. Her conspiracism leads her very quickly toward anti-Semitism. That might in part be the Kanye West thing. And actually in 2019, she's forced to resign from Turning Point USA because she has become so outspoken about her affection for Adolf Hitler and defending Kanye West from saying horrible things and so on. So, but then, now this is the interesting thing. She kind of gets rehabilitated in 2021. She's hired at the Daily Wire by Ben Shapiro and Jeremy Boring, who are the editors there, and defines the issue of current right-wing culture war politics. I mean, that's what's happening at the Daily Wire there, is they're starting to cook the anti-trans stuff. But Ben Shapiro is also a very proud Jew. And so I don't really get it why Shapiro thought this was a good idea, except perhaps it speaks to the real paucity of Black figures in the Republican Party right now.
Well, that's certainly true. I had forgotten this part
Yeah.
like it's sort of hard to keep up with every twist and turn in Candace Owens' life and career. So this one's had sort of, I'd forgotten it. It dropped out of my memory of all the things she's done. I also think it's hard to remember, again, because of like who she's come to be and the anti-Israel politics and just the blatant anti-Semitism that she's shown in the last couple of years. Knowing that, it's hard to think that Ben Shapiro would ever, be chummy with her, let alone have brought her into the Daily Wire. But I do think it sort of speaks to maybe also a moment in 2021 when that was not really as pronounced, right? Like it's anti-vaccine time, it's anti-trans time, it's anti-DI, like that's what was foregrounded in that year, that sort of, early year into the only Biden administration. So I think that's probably what was happening there. But, it didn't take long for the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories to come raging back in terms of Owens' focus, and it really intensified around the attack of October 7th, 2023, right? Like, I mean, she just was saying all sorts of things. Not surprisingly, Ben Shapiro was not going to put up with that anymore, and kicked her out.
Yeah. And it really, on a certain level, I think it's October 7th kind of woke Ben Shapiro up, because she's really the same person, but she's also, and this is something that would be admirable if she didn't say such horrible things and lead people in such horrible directions. She sticks to her principles. And so Ben Shapiro tells her on October 7th, you have to stop doing this. It's not okay anymore. And she's like, no, this is what I believe. And also, she believes in CIA conspiracy. She believes in false flag operations. There's a range of things. And she does it, and we'll get back to this with the Erica Kirk stuff. She does it in this very sort of old school internet way. Do you remember that moment on the internet? It was around the turn of the 21st century where people would sort of gather on blogs and solve problems together.
Yeah.
And, they called it hive mind, but there were all of these people who were like doing these boring jobs, at law firms and everything like that. And they would sort of get together and like solve cases.
Yeah.
There was Casey Johnson, who was investigating the Duke lacrosse scandal. And I think, much as I detest the man and much as I think those lacrosse players were truly horrible human beings, it appears, in fact, they did not rape that exotic dancer. And I think without Casey Johnson and his minions doing all that work, they might have easily gotten convicted of that crime. So there is a moment on the internet where it's all about the documents and having people read the documents and compare the documents, or the George Bush Air National Guard thing, where it was literally people on the internet that figured out these are different typewriters. That document is fake.
Yeah.
And it really took down CBS's reporting on that. So that's what Candace actually does. And she's very dogged about it. Now, her current campaign against Turning Point USA, and I have to admit, I only listened to 2.5 episodes of Bride of Charlie because I just had to stop. My brain was leaking out my ears and so on. But it's the same kind of thing. And there's one episode where she pauses for about 20 minutes on this allegation that Erica Kirk has lied about her birthday, and that there are different birthdays listed in different documents. And she'll like show you these documents, and then she'll say, now, why would she do that?
Yes.
And I'm like, I don't know, Candace, why would she do that? And she's like, just hang on. So it is a clever narrative technique, but she's also like really creating a narrative about American life that actually you can't trust anybody.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, exactly. Yes. And I mean, we've touched on this, I think, quite a bit in recent episodes, just sort of the history of conspiracy thinking, particularly the sort of politics of it, and how it has animated a faction of the right. And I think that, in the example of Candace Owens, we get to think about it in the age of social media and internet influencing. Because I think, as you've sort of been talking about with the early 21st century sort of blog culture that arose to sort of crack cases, all of that has been hypercharged in recent years, I think in large part because of, having a conspiracist in the White House, and the way that that's just sort of, I think, opened up a fringe culture and made it much more normalized across the American right. And there, there's versions of this on the left as well, but it doesn't have the same sort of power that it does, I think, for so many, people who are on the right. Owens is really talented. I cannot watch more than a minute or so of her because I find it so uncomfortable. And I'm sort of impressed you listened as much as you did, although I know it was for, research, but
naturally
it is sort of astounding to me that there are folks that consume this for hours and hours a day, every day, but we know they do. And that certainly Candace Owens is not the only person providing this sort of stuff, but I'm just asking questions has been sort of an animating feature of a big portion of conservative politics in the last decade. Candace Owens is taking that and, running with it to great effect. But, I see her tweets more than I see anything else because, again, I don't want to tune in, but I can't turn on Twitter or whatever it's called these days without one of her tweets being right there in front of me. And it's a lot of it is stay tuned, right? I'll let you know more in a minute. And that feels, I'm interested in sort of tracing out the history of that. How do we imagine that in a history of gimmicks and salesmanship and stuff that doesn't necessarily have to do with politics? There's a lot converging in the person of Candace Owens and how she's sort of primed for this moment.
Well, you know what it reminds me of a lot, just as I was sitting here listening to you, is the narrative structure of soap operas.
Yeah.
When soap operas, I don't know if they still do, but they used to be on every afternoon. And there were certain ones that, you would run home from school to tune into Dark Shadows or Edge of Night or something like that. Or All My Children. That was a biggie because the woman who wrote All My Children, her daughter went to my school. So we were always going to this room at the school to watch All My Children in the middle of the day with Emily. And soap operas move a plot along excruciatingly slowly. And they always end with something that will be, we hope, resolved tomorrow. So I think Owens and other influencers, female influencers, I don't think male influencers do this, but female influencers are always stay online. And that is, of course, why platforms like X and YouTube and Rumble and so on profit so much from them, because they keep eyeballs sort of trained to the cell phone, trained to the pings all the time. I think the part that's tricky about Candace Owens, and this is why the Stanford High School thing just sort of lingers in my mind, is in many ways that's what racism is. It's a conspiracy against Black people. And you can psychologize it, and you can talk about the law, and you can talk about linguistic structures and so on. But when it really comes down to it, the structure of racism is a conspiracy to keep Black people from getting power and influence. And it's a crude way of talking about it. But so it's like she's speaking from the inside of a conspiracy theory, a lived experience of conspiracy. Then the whole Gamergate, platform thing happens, and it's like, all right, her life as a businesswoman suddenly gets torn apart by what everyone can easily believe is an online conspiracy because it's already been happening and she stepped into it. So in a way, she is positioning herself, I am the victim of conspiracies. Therefore, I can detect them wherever they are, whether it's the CIA, whether it's Israel, whether it's Emmanuel Macron. I mean, she's currently being sued by the president of France.
Insane. Crazy.
And his wife, because she insists that Brigitte Macron was born a man and is, in fact, now a transgender woman. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but actually, she isn't.
Right.
Right? So I think sort of positioning herself as the person who knows, the person who will help you by interpreting a world that is too complex for any of you to ever understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and just like, I like that you brought in the soap opera thing, because I think that's sort of what I was trying to get to. Is like there's something here that's like cultural, that's beyond just sort of the realm of politics, right? And like, what are the other sort of antecedents of this sort of like narrative style, this sort of way of engaging audiences, the way of being a star of storytelling, and then also this history of conspiracism and sort of the politics of conspiracy theory. All of it seems to be just sort of really gathering together in a really fascinating way with her, as we've talked about, also incredibly destructive too. And I think sort of seeing her battle with folks on the fringe of, well, it's not the fringe in terms of its like influence, but like, you know, the sort of characters that she was like aligned with for a long time, and seeing them also sort of turn on each other around a lot of these conspiracies is also sort of fascinating, and sort of speaks to how these things open up, I think, sort of different subgroups of what we tend to think of as just like Trump supporters, right? Like there's these interesting sort of subcategories of people, especially when we're talking about like the ones that like are hyper online and really living their lives in this sort of social media conservative universe.
Yeah. Well, and actually, to bring in another cultural phenomenon, which I just thought of as you were talking, this whole confrontation with Erica Kirk, which we should dig into a little bit. Listeners, remember, Erica Kirk is Charlie Kirk's widow. She has inherited the mantle of CEO of Turning Point USA. Now that Charlie is gone, she has been doing endless speaking tours. She has engaged in a great deal of public grieving. There are also a great many conspiracy theories that have come up around Charlie Kirk's death, many of which Candace Owens has promoted. And so Candace has sort of positioned herself as the anti-Erica. And okay, now let's think about the visual here. Erica Kirk is a white, blonde beauty queen. Candace Owens is a African-American woman who was marginalized from Turning Point USA. Now, she claims that she was Charlie Kirk's best friend in the world, right? And so there's a little piece of, you know, Erica Kirk is just a gold digger. Yep. And she actually says this, that Erica Kirk only married Charlie so that she could get her mitts on Turning Point USA. Thus, the suspicion that Erica Kirk probably had Charlie Kirk killed so that she could get hold of this multi-million-dollar nonprofit. And what Owens keeps saying in the Bride of Charlie thing is, why would you just turn over a 501c3 that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars to someone who has just been at home raising children and has absolutely no experience in running anything? Why would you do that? So one cultural parallel that I'm also seeing here, and tell me if this is wrong, because I actually haven't seen these movies, but Wicked, which is like the prehistory of Glinda, the Good Witch from The Wizard of Oz, and the Wicked Witch of the West. Well, the prehistory is that they went to witch school together, and then they became enemies, and I think they finally come back together. But I found it significant all along that the Witch of the West, I can't remember what her name is, but she's played by Thank you so much. Trust a gay man. Elphaba is played by a black actress and Glinda is played by a white actress. And, when I was sort of watching this play out, and Erica and Candace had like a 4-hour sit down to hash out their differences, which has done Erica Kirk no good whatsoever. It really seems like a kind of Elphaba Glinda face-off of some kind. Like these are two of the planets that were rotating around Charlie. And now one of them is going to live and one of them is going to die.
Right. Only one of them can emerge from this, right? Like
Right.
that's the stakes of it. I hadn't thought about the connection to Wicked. I like creative thinking there. I definitely cannot unsee Erica Kirk as Glinda now that you've said it. And
Totally.
and it's like, it's one of those things where it should not shock anyone, but I cannot stand Candace Owens. However, when I go onto Twitter, as I said, and her tweets are the ones that come up, and it happens to be one of those tweets attacking Erica Kirk and sort of pointing out the performative grief and like raising questions about how this woman is
Right.
been handed this and what's she doing, shouldn't she be mourning and stuff, as opposed to like touring all over the country. I kind of nod in agreement. I suppose there's lots of other folks who are saying those same things that don't have all the baggage that Candace Owens has. But that said, all of this is just fascinating again because, a lot of this is predicated on, as you said, Candace Owens being like, I was his best friend. Now, that's a claim that where's the evidence for that? I mean, how do we substantiate that?
You.
Yeah, how do we substantiate that? And what does that even mean when someone is, married and has a family and why does that mean that she's the one that knows the real truth and Erica Kirk doesn't? I also think like we got to bring the anti-Semitism thing back into this because a lot of this is based on Candace claiming that Charlie Kirk was changing his position on Israel. And I think there's like a tiny, tiny bit of evidence for that. But again, this is sort of how conspiracies work. Like you use a tiny bit of evidence to then suggest something much bigger. And she was, she's saying that he was about to say something quite, he was really going to change his politics when it came to Israel. And that's why he was killed. And on and on and on and on. And so the conspiracy there and the connection to sort of her anti-Semitism and her anti-Israel politics is highly relevant in this particular example of Charlie Kirk and of Erica Kirk and sort of what Owens is saying about Turning Point USA.
I think that's right. And I had another thought too, because as I was researching this episode, I went online and, just sort of threw one of those things into the AI that said, how much is Candace Owens worth? She's worth $5 million, which, okay, everybody would like $5 million in a bank account with their name on it. But in this world, in this influencer world, it's really not much. And, Joe Rogan is worth hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
Turning Point USA is probably worth $300 or $400 million. The Erica Kirk lives in a house that is probably worth $2.5 million, which, Candace would like to know where she got the money for that. But there is another piece of this that really made me think of our friend Leah Wright Rigueur's book, The Loneliness of the Black Conservative, and the level to which Black conservatives are inevitably marginalized within a conservative Republican Party. And Leah sort of looks at that moment from like the 1960s through the 1980s when Black Republicans are basically squeezed out of any influence whatsoever. And that is the turn. Reagan is the turn where the Republican Party says we are never going to talk about race again. It is racist to talk about race, which makes it actually impossible to advocate for Black people as a Black conservative. And so there is a part of me that says, Candace Owens says and does horrible things. They are very damaging things. Anti-vaxxism is killing people. It's literally killing people. That being said, there is a piece of this where if she's sitting at home saying, why did Erica Kirk get everything and I got nothing? She's right. And so if she is trying at this point to make a lot of money off of ginning up this battle with Erica Kirk, it is a kind of revenge scenario for a life in which he's never actually been allowed to fit in anywhere.
Yeah, I think there's so much psychology at work here, which like we aren't really equipped to fully analyze, but it also feels so in your face, how much, because I think so much of her story, she has foregrounded story, you know, so much of her like biography, she's foregrounded these stories that, you know, are sort of ripe with psychological meaning.
Yep.
I think you're right about the very sort of precarity of her position in the world that she's chosen to like pursue a career and pursue influence. I'm really struck by that $5 million. And again, it's not nothing, but it's peanuts compared to, you know, a lot of her peers here. And I think, you know, for her, for all the reasons that you've noted, you know, questions about how long she can maintain this have to be ever present in her mind.
Right.
Now she could examine those, and that could lead her to very different conclusions and very different choices than it appears she's making. So the questions are not wrong at all. How she chooses to answer them, I think, is a different matter.
Right. All right. Well, we're going to leave Candace for now and maybe roll back to her, check in with her and Erica at a later date. What do you want to go viral this week, Neil?
It's kind of a 2-for-1. I want a book review to go viral. And so also hopefully the book itself will. So the book is a book by Matthew Avery Sutton, a historian of religion. The book is titled Chosen Land: How Christianity Made America and Americans Remade Christianity. But I want to talk about it by way of this really beautiful review in The Atlantic by Heath Carter, another historian of American religion. And the piece is called Americans Should Stop Using the Term Christian Nationalism. Now, just full disclosure, Matt Avery and Heath Carter are, you know, friends of mine or people I'm friendly with, people who, you know, are sort of colleagues in the world of religious history that I keep a toe or two in. So, you know, just fully disclosing that. Matt Sutton is a phenomenal historian. He's written a bunch of great books. This one just came out, Chosen Land. It's a history of how American Christians, and sort of emphasis on the plurality of that, have influenced American politics, and sort of taking up this like and the review that Heath writes really spent a lot of time on this, like, you know, Christian nationalism, it's become this like bugaboo, it's become this thing that we talk about all the time, but it's meant to be really one thing, you know, MAGA folks who are Trump supporters. And as Matt Sutton shows in his history, in his book, there's a long history that could point to a diverse set of religious actors, many from the left, who we might understand as Christian nationalists if we imagine that Christian nationalism was figures who believed their faith should influence how the nation looked. And that in a lot of examples, especially in the early 20th century, these are folks on the left who believe that there needs to be a strong social safety net, that there needs to be a welfare state, that there needs to be all sorts of things that we would and they imagined and they saw as progressive politics that were deeply tied to their Christian faith. And so that's just a really, I think, important history to be mindful of. And, you know, Heath, and I think Matt makes this point in his book too, that says that like all of this sort of, you know, causes us to all of this raises the point that perhaps Christian nationalism is just not really a useful term for us to sort of engage anymore if we really understand this wider history. But I think the thing that I also sort of mention here is Heath Carter pulls out this thread from Matt's book and sort of raises this point about what do people mean when they say that Christians shouldn't be involved in politics, which is a lot of what the conversation now around Christian nationalism is. Especially what does it mean when folks on the left seem really supportive of folks like James Tallarico, who is, articulating over and over again how his Christian faith, means X, Y, and Z, and why he should be, the next senator from Texas. And so Heath Carter really pursues this sort of line of thinking and says that really what folks are saying is not that Christians shouldn't be involved in politics, but sort of which Christianity. And that we need to be sort of clear about that as the sort of question that's being raised, or sort of the thing that's being thought about when it comes to American politics, and sort of the role of faith and the role of faith actors in it. So there's a lot more that's really worth sort of reading this review for, but I just want to read this one sentence. An honest accounting requires acknowledging that reactionaries are not the only ones who have followed Jesus into the public square. Many left-of-center folks have done the same and are doing so even today, as underscored by the widespread scenes of church-based activism in the Twin Cities during the recent ICE operation there. I'll just read the whole paragraph. This acknowledgement might push progressives to lay aside the unpersuasive critique that the MAGA agenda is too religious, and to focus instead on the specific values and policies that they believe deserve serious theological critique and concerted political confrontation. So read the review in The Atlantic and pick up Matt's new book. I think they're both really worth exploring.
It's fantastic, and we're going to link to both of them. I've been seeing Matt's book popping up in my feeds, and every time I see it, I want to order it. And then every time I don't order it because I'm like, oh my God, I have so many other things to read. But you have actually persuaded me. I do need to read this book. And you know what I think is really important, Neil, is, and maybe we will see this if Tallarico remains a national figure, is it's very common nowadays to see Christian conservatives praying in public, to see, we've seen Jewish Americans both in the Gaza encampments and outside the Gaza encampments being very religious in public. We see Muslims being very religious in public. We have pictures now of Zoran Mamdani going to prayers in the evening or breaking his Ramadan fast. Left Christians stopped being Christian in public around the civil rights movement or something, or at least white left Christians, excuse me. And Christianity in a progressive sense is something in the Democratic Party that's been kind of relegated to Black Americans. And then there's this sort of thought about Hispanic Americans. Oh yeah, they're religious. That means they're actually a little more conventional than the rest of us, and I think it's a public discussion that should be had, because I think there are a great many Christians out there who are utterly and completely alienated from a Republican Party they actually spent their whole adult lives in, and Democrats are not offering anything to them to say, yes, we love you and we want to work with you and pray with you. So thank you very much, Neil. That's great. Well, I have sort of the opposite of that, but it's also a book. I want listeners to read Sarah Weinman's new book, Without Consent, A Landmark Trial in a Decades-Long Struggle to Make Spousal Rape a Crime. Came out late last year. It's about the Greta and John Rideout case, a 1978 case in which Greta Rideout went to court and said that her husband, who had been beating her, and everybody knew he beat her, that he also sexually assaulted her. And in 1978, marital rape was not a crime in many states. And in fact, it was a carve out from many rape laws, that actually rape could be prosecuted unless the woman was married to her husband. And there was sort of like this big open space. And you can see in Sarah's book that judges and defense attorneys are actually kind of uncomfortable with the idea that husbands can just rape their wives with impunity. But they sort of create all this doubt around it. You know, it's like, well, you married him. That means you have blanket consented to sexual intercourse. And the idea that sexual intercourse could be a part of an abusive cycle was not something that anybody wanted to think about. And I think it's something that people still don't want to think about. It was a crime that could not even be charged in most states. And so what Weinman writes about is how this case triggers a reexamination of marital rape and actually changes the law state by state. A big figure in this case is a woman named Laura X, who was a radical feminist, very famous radical feminist. She's still alive. I actually met her. And she sees the Rideout case. She's living in Berkeley at the time, and she decides I have to make this my mission. And of course, 1978, it's 3 years after Susan Brown Miller publishes Against Our Will. So there's a lot on the national agenda about rape, but it takes this case of Greta Rideout. And by the way, John Rideout is acquitted of raping his wife. Wow. And it's that acquittal that puts a lot of activists in motion to say, how could she have been treated this way? She's treated a way in court that you're not even allowed to treat people who have suffered from stranger rape. Rideout was a very courageous woman. There are a lot of courageous women in this book. But I also want to say something about Sarah Weinman, whose last book was about the legal case from which Nabokov wrote Lolita.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's called The Real Lolita.
Yeah.
So
I remember that.
Weinman writes reviews of mystery books for the New York Times. That's her day job. But what she's really interested in is the afterlife of crimes. What crimes actually, how do crimes sort of persist in the culture? How do they stay with us? How do they become a turning point? And this book has a really interesting ending that I don't want to spoil it by telling people, but the Greta and John Rideout case is the beginning of the examination of a lot of different cases. But at the end of the book, we meet Greta and John again. And, all right, I'll leave it there. But it's a really good book. It's a terrific read. Sarah's a wonderful writer. And it's a kind of little-known aspect of feminist history that I think everyone should know in this Women's History Month.
Well, this is my version of what you just did after mine, which is that I have this on the book list of like things to buy, but keep telling myself not to because of the same reasons. And you've just moved it to the front of the cart line at Amazon.com or wherever. But I think I'd read like a blurb about this in the New Yorker a few weeks or months ago, and it was just like, whoa, this sounds amazing. I hadn't put together that she also wrote The Real Lolita, so that makes me even more intrigued and wanting to read both of those together, particularly in what you just said about her interest in being sort of the history and the sort of ongoing reverberations of a crime in culture. Catnip to a historian.
Catnip to a historian. And with that, Neil, I think we're done for the week. It's been great seeing you and talking about Candace Owens and everything else. And I'll see you next week.
See you next week.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is Whispering Waltz by Moments. You can find their work and all the talented artists we feature on these episodes on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.